Today's mindful moment, packed with insights but designed to fit into your busy life. One deep dive at a time. Okay, so today we're going deep on this one. We're diving into Rashid Khalidi's The 100 Years' War on Palestine.
Yeah.
It's a book that I think offers a perspective that many people might not be familiar with.
Right.
Especially, if they're just looking at sort of the mainstream media and how it's portrayed.
Right.
And that is the idea of framing this conflict as a century-long struggle against settler colonialism.
Absolutely. And it's something that Khalidi really meticulously traces back to the very beginnings of the Zionist movement.
Yeah.
And what's so interesting is he reveals these early warnings that were, really kind of ignored or dismissed.
I mean, are you talking about like Yusuf D. al-Khalidi's letter to Herzl back in 1899? I mean, that's a pretty
it's chilling
exchange. Yeah.
Absolutely chilling. I mean, here you have this very prominent Palestinian intellectual, al-Khalidi, expressing this concern over the potential for Palestinians to be displaced if a Jewish state were to be established in their homeland.
Right.
And then you have Herzl's response, which really hints at almost a plan to make that native population disappear.
It's almost like a blueprint for what we see unfold.
Yeah. In a way, yeah.
But, I mean, I guess the question is, was Herzl truly representative of the entire Zionist movement at that time?
That's a really complex question. I mean, while Herzl was a very key figure, the Zionist movement itself was very diverse. I mean, there were varying opinions on how to actually achieve a Jewish state. But this exchange undeniably foreshadows these tensions that are to come and raises these really serious ethical questions about those early ambitions and the impact it would have on the people who were already living there.
Yeah, and I think, that kind of sets the stage for this whole century of struggle that Khalidi is arguing is deeply rooted in this concept of settler colonialism.
Right.
Can you kind of unpack that a little bit more? What does he mean by that?
So Khalidi's point is that it wasn't just about two groups kind of vying for the same piece of land.
Right.
It was really about a movement that was seeking to establish a state for one group in a land that was already inhabited by another.
Yeah.
And that ultimately leads to displacement and dispossession.
Right. So then you have the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which pledged British support for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine.
And the Balfour Declaration is crucial because it reflects that role of these international powers in really shaping the contours of this conflict.
Yeah.
What's often overlooked is that while it does mention safeguarding the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities, it doesn't address their political or national rights at all.
Yeah.
And that omission really laid the groundwork for the inequalities that would kind of come to define the conflict for decades to come.
Yeah. And it wasn't just this political maneuvering. I mean, real lives were being impacted.
Absolutely.
World War I, for instance, had a profound effect on Palestine.
The war brought famine, displacement, and it created immense hardship for Palestinians.
Right.
And it really fueled the sense of Palestinian nationalism.
Right.
So they were grappling with not only the implications of the Balfour Declaration, but also these really harsh realities of a war on their doorstep.
Right. It was a lot.
Yeah, it was a period of immense upheaval.
Yeah. And then you have the British Mandate for Palestine in 1920.
Right.
That's intended to pave the way for Jewish statehood.
Yeah, and during the Mandate period, you really see the Zionist movement gain strength, partially because of British support.
Right.
The establishment of the Jewish Agency, for example, gave Zionists a lot of political and economic influence.
Right.
It was a privilege that just wasn't extended to Palestinians.
Yeah, so you have this growing disparity in power and resources.
Exactly.
Which ultimately leads to the Palestinian Arab Revolt of 1936-39.
And this revolt was just a desperate attempt by Palestinians to resist British rule and Zionist expansion.
Right.
While it was ultimately unsuccessful, it really solidified Palestinian national identity.
Yeah.
And it showed their willingness to fight for their rights.
Right.
It was a real turning point.
Yeah. And then, of course, this brings us to 1948 and the Nakba, the catastrophe marking the creation of Israel and the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their homes.
And Khalidi uses his own family's experience during this time to really personalize this tragedy.
Right.
And it's so powerful because the Nakba is central to his argument.
Yeah.
It's not just a historical event.
Right.
It's this lived experience of loss and dispossession that continues to shape Palestinian identity and their claims for justice.
Right. So he's really bringing this human cost into sharp focus through his family's story.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a really powerful element of the book.
And that's just the beginning. I mean, the post-1948 era brings a whole new set of challenges and complexities to this 100 Years' War.
Absolutely.
So we'll delve into that in the next part of our deep dive.
Sounds good. Yeah, so as we move into like the period after the Nakba, right? The global landscape is changing a lot.
Okay.
The U.S. emerges as like this dominant force in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And their unwavering support for Israel really has a profound impact on the whole conflict.
Khalidi does not, hold back at all on critiquing that
Bro,
U.S. involvement.
He doesn't mince words.
He doesn't. He really doesn't.
No, he argues that this unwavering support has really perpetuated the conflict,
Yeah.
often at the expense of Palestinians, of course.
Yeah.
And he examines all these different administrations,
Yeah.
from Truman to Obama, and how their actions and even inaction
Yeah.
shaped the course of events, like the 1967 war,
Right.
which resulted in Israel's occupation of the West Bank, Gaza,
Right.
East Jerusalem.
Mhm.
And that was followed by UN Security Council Resolution 242.
Yeah. Resolution 242, I mean, at least on the surface, seemed like, okay, maybe this is a step towards peace.
Right.
It called for Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories.
Right. But as Khalidi points out, it doesn't really fully address Palestinian self-determination.
Right.
It was ambiguous,
Yeah.
leaving a lot of room for interpretation,
Right.
ultimately failing to address those root causes of the conflict.
It's that ambiguity that just seems to plague all of these attempts at peace
Exactly.
for, decades.
Exactly. It keeps coming up again and again.
Yeah. And right in this, really turbulent time,
Yeah.
you have the emergence of the Palestine Liberation Organization.
Right, a PLO. Yeah.
The PLO, and their rise is really significant.
Right.
It signifies this shift towards organized Palestinian resistance.
Right.
And Yasser Arafat kind of emerges as a key figure at this point.
Yeah, but Khalidi's also pretty critical
Yeah.
of the PLO's internal divisions
Yeah.
and some of their strategic missteps. He points to their initial strategy of armed struggle,
Right.
which didn't really work.
Right. Didn't pan out.
Yeah, it proved ineffective.
Yeah.
And then he analyzes their later adoption of the two-state solution, which was a big change
Yeah.
for them, and their relationship with Arab states.
Yeah.
Which was complicated
Yeah.
and often influenced their decisions.
Right.
It was complex, and then you have the Oslo Accords in the 90s.
Right. Oslo initially hailed as a breakthrough,
Yeah, there was so much hope, so much
Yeah.
promise of a peaceful resolution.
but it unraveled.
It did.
It totally unraveled. Why?
Well, Khalidi argues that Oslo, while offering a glimmer of hope, was fundamentally flawed.
Okay.
It failed to address these key issues like Israeli settlement expansion,
Right.
the status of Jerusalem,
Right.
the right of return for Palestinian refugees.
So essentially just kind of kicked the can down the road on the really tough conversations.
And it created this system of limited Palestinian autonomy,
Right.
but under Israeli control.
Right.
It wasn't a true,
Right.
sharing of power.
And it led to disillusionment on both sides.
It did.
Yeah.
And it really contributed to that outbreak of the Second Intifada in 2000.
Which was just an incredibly violent time.
Yeah.
I mean, you had the suicide bombings, the Israeli military operations.
Yeah, it was a major escalation.
And then you have Hamas,
Right.
this Islamist group that was opposed to Oslo.
Yeah.
Just further complicates this whole political scene.
Yeah, it adds another layer of complexity
Yeah.
to the situation.
And Khalidi really digs into how that escalation in violence,
Yeah.
fueled by the failures of Oslo,
Right.
the rise of Hamas,
Yeah.
impacted both societies.
He does, and he doesn't shy away from criticizing the actions of both sides.
Right.
And highlighting how they contributed to this cycle of violence.
Yeah, yeah.
It was a very dark time for everyone involved.
And this brings us to, maybe one of the most harrowing chapters in the book,
Yeah.
Israel's repeated military operations in Gaza,
Yeah.
particularly the 2014 war.
It was devastating.
It was devastating, yeah.
Khalidi focuses on the impact on civilians in Gaza.
Right.
And he highlights this controversial Dahiya doctrine,
Right.
which was an Israeli military strategy involving like disproportionate force
Yeah.
against civilian areas, which
Yeah.
raises concerns about war crimes
Yeah.
and collective punishment.
It's just this stark reminder of the brutal reality of this conflict. Yeah.
It's
The human cost of this just ongoing struggle.
Absolutely.
But I mean, where does this leave us today?
Right.
I mean, where does Khalidi see this going in the 21st century?
It's a big question.
So here we are, kind of at a critical point, I think, in our deep dive into the 100 Years' War on Palestine.
Yeah.
After a century of conflict, where does Khalidi see things heading? Like, what's next?
It's tough. He doesn't really offer these easy answers.
Right.
Or simple solutions.
Right.
He acknowledges that Palestinians are facing immense challenges, obviously.
Right.
But he doesn't want people to just give up hope. No. You know, he's calling for like a fundamental shift in how we understand the whole conflict.
Yeah.
And how we view the possibilities for change.
He really puts a lot of emphasis on challenging the dominant narrative, particularly in the U.S.
Oh, absolutely. He's incredibly critical of U.S. policy, you know.
Yeah.
He argues that it's consistently prioritized Israeli interests over Palestinian rights.
Right.
And that this unwavering support is a huge obstacle to achieving any kind of, like, just and lasting peace.
Yeah, he even goes as far as to call out, like, the Trump deal of the century.
Oh, yeah.
As kind of a culmination of these decades of failed U.S. policy.
Right. Like, it was just the most blatant example.
Favoring one side significantly over the other.
Exactly. And failing to address, like, the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinians.
So what are the alternatives? What does he propose? Like, where does he see potential for change?
Well, first and foremost, he stresses how important it is to acknowledge the colonial roots of this.
Okay.
He thinks that's crucial for understanding, like, the power imbalances and the historical injustices that have fueled this conflict for so long.
Yeah.
He's saying, like, until that fundamental reality is recognized, true peace will be impossible.
It's like he's asking us to, like, you know, completely re-examine the foundation that this conflict is built on.
Exactly. Go back to the very beginning.
Yeah, but how do you propose that happens?
Yeah.
Like, how do you actually get people to do that?
Well, he emphasizes shifting public opinion, especially in the United States.
Okay.
He believes that Palestinians need to engage directly with Americans, share their stories, and challenge that pro-Israel bias that's dominated U.S. policy for so long.
So almost going beyond
the
established political channels.
Yeah, like grassroots kind of.
Right, and connecting directly with the people.
Exactly.
Yeah. But he's also critical of the Palestinian leadership, right?
He criticizes the PLO's reliance on the U.S. as a mediator.
Oh, really? Right.
Yeah, he's like, the U.S. can't be an honest broker in this.
Yeah.
So he suggests looking at other avenues for international mediation and building alliances with other countries who are more sympathetic.
So kind of diversifying their efforts.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But it's not all about international diplomacy, is it?
No, not at all. Khalidi's a big advocate for grassroots activism, too.
Okay.
He believes that people power is essential for achieving change.
Okay.
He's like, Palestinians need to organize, mobilize, resist.
So it's this multi-pronged approach.
Yeah.
It's changing the narrative, building international support, and empowering grassroots movement.
Exactly. Has to be all of those things.
So at the end of the day, what is Khalidi's 100 Years' War on Palestine offering to us as readers?
It's more than just history, you know. It's a call to action. It challenges us to confront our own biases, our assumptions, and to really engage with this conflict in a much deeper way.
It's asking us to go beyond just the headlines.
Absolutely. And those, like, really simplified narratives that we often hear.
Right, to actually grapple with the complexity of it all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if you're looking for a deeper understanding of this conflict, one that, like, digs into the historical roots and the forces that are shaping the present, this book is, like, essential reading.
Yeah, it's a good one.
You can find The 100 Years' War on Palestine at Insert Link.
Awesome.
It'll challenge you, inform you, and I think it will stay with you.
Yeah, it's a book that makes you think.
It does.
Yeah, and be sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more intellectually stimulating discussions like this one.
Yes, please do.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, keep diving deep. You'll find a link to purchase the book in the show notes.